Welcome to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast
with Garrett Williamson.
Health, wellness, exercise, nutrition, and a whole lot more. Got questions? Call us and leave a message at 251-278-EDGE or message us at Personal Edge Fitness on Facebook and Instagram, at Team PE on Twitter, or personaledgefitness.com.
Today, I'm hoping that if no other podcast gets your heart beating, today's episode should. So we're going to be talking all about heart rate and heart rate training. And this is Garrett Williamson. You are listening to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast. And if you're interested in asking any questions for me, or you're interested in, I try to come up with plenty of information, things that I get asked a lot about, or things that I see in the news, or things that are popular, that are hot. But if there's any particular topic that you're interested in, something you want to hear about, something you've never quite understood, no matter what it is, we try to dispel the myths of health, fitness, and wellness on this show. So if there's anything you have any questions about, feel free to get in touch with me. You can contact me at garrett@personaledgefitness.com. Believe me, I will respond to your email. Contact me there. You can also get me through my website and also our Facebook page. But today we're talking about heart rate. Now, this is something that actually, they started studying this in the late 60s, early 70s. Started talking about studying heart rate training and the advantages of monitoring your heart rate or training at the right heart rate level. But there's a lot of misinformation out there, and like everything else in health and fitness, these ideas come out that are fads at times. They pervert the truth. And then also there's a lot of updating that goes on. So hopefully I can clear the air on heart rate training, starting out telling you what it is, and there's a whole language that goes along with it. We're going to go through that and breaking it down to the simplest of levels, and show you some different ways to get involved in heart rate training, and why you should, why there's important reasons to track your heart rate during your exercise, and it will help you get to your goals a lot faster, that's for sure. So heart rate training, here we go. Heart rate and blood pressure. I want to touch on that real quick. So I've got a podcast that we're going to be doing talking about blood pressure. That's a very hot topic, and a lot of billions, so really a $1 billion industry as far as blood pressure is concerned. But blood pressure and heart rate are two different things, and you may already know this, so don't tune out too quickly. But just to break it down simply, heart rate's your pulse. It's basically how fast your heart's beating. How hard is that muscle having to work to get blood going around your body? And when it's getting blood going around your body, it's actually getting energy going around your body, because that's oxygenated blood that it's pumping, and that's how we get oxygen to our body. And as you've heard me talk about before, oxygen equals energy. So blood pressure is basically the pressure that your vessels are experiencing as far as the blood going through it. If your vessels are constricted, your heart rate goes up. In other words, you start pumping blood faster, then you're going to have a spike in your blood pressure. But as those arteries and those veins start to become more pliable, they start to get warmed up, they actually flex, they actually expand, which it lessens the pressure on the arterial walls, which is your blood pressure, which makes your blood pressure go down. So it's a very simple difference between heart rate being your pulse, and blood pressure just being the pressure inside the arterial and vein walls, the vascular walls of your blood vessels. They don't necessarily go up at the same rate or go down at the same rate. There's not a strong tie. There's a tie to them, but there's not a strong tie to your heart rate and blood pressure. I'll talk more about this when I get involved in blood pressure, but when we have somebody come in, their blood pressure is slightly elevated, especially that bottom number, which is the diastolic number. If it's slightly elevated, we would typically start somebody out on cardio and raise their heart rate up just a little bit. In other words, wake their body up, get more blood pumping through so that those vessels become warmed up and more pliable, and therefore their blood pressure goes down. That's the one connection I will talk about heart rate and blood pressure. So let's get some terminology out of the way. These are terms that I'm sure you've heard, but let's tell you what they are. First thing is max heart rate. Well, as it sounds, it's actually your predicted maximum heart rate. Now, I say predicted because there's a few different ways to determine your maximum heart rate. There's a few different ways to determine your cardio zone, your heart rate zone, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But maximum heart rate is basically where, at your fitness level, a lot of people think it's associated with age. There's an age estimation, but you know how I feel about that. Age is not a measurement of fitness. So I'm going to say it's basically slightly determined by your fitness level, but how high should be the top end for your heart rate. And that's what maximum heart rate is. So we've got submax. I threw submax in there because it's not one you hear very often unless you're doing testing, cardio testing, but you've heard submax. And submax is something that we don't typically use in training, but submax is where it's about 70% of your maximum, 70 to 75%. It's what I call the lower end of the cardiac zone, and we'll get to that in just a minute, but that's what submax is. So if you've ever heard of max cardiac testing or submax testing. And they'll do this when they go in and when somebody goes in and has what they call a treadmill test in a cardiology office, they'll either do a max or a submax test. A max test is one they're trying to get you to go to your maximum heart rate. A submax, they're just trying to bring it up to 70, 75 and do a simple test on your cardiac function. Quick note on that, pretty interesting. In most situations, most fitness situations, I learned this in my internship. I found this pretty fascinating. Up to a certain age, when we were predicting, using age to predict people's health, we would do submax testing. But once people got over a certain age, typically it was 40, or at that time 40, that was 25 years ago. I'm sure it's raised now. They would do max testing with those individuals. And I thought that was interesting. That with a older, therefore you assume, and that is a strong assumption, you assume that it's a less fit population, you're going to take them and max test them and not submax. Now, that sounded backwards to me. Sounded like you didn't want to take somebody that was less fit and run them up to a maximum test. And we'd actually have to have a cardiologist in the room when we would test these people out for this particular fitness center where I trained, because we test everybody before they start working out in the facility. And the reason we would take those individuals to max testing is if they were going to have an event associated with exercise, which is actually very rare. We're going to talk about that in a minute too. Then they wanted to have it on the treadmill with the cardiologist in the room while they were hooked up to an EKG. And if you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, we want to really test this. We want to find out if we're going to have a problem. We want to have it happen. We want to find out now. So that's the reason we did max testing with people that were older and submax with people that were generally more fit but younger. Resting heart rate. Well, that's just as it sounds. It's your heart rate at rest. But resting heart rate is a fantastic measurement of fitness. Now, I talk about the fact that age does not determine fitness. I talk about the fact that weight is not a measurement of fitness. As weight is the gravitational pull of the earth on your body. Well, resting heart rate is a measurement of fitness. And one of the things we're going to get into in just a minute. In the last terminology here, I did max heart rate, we did submax, resting heart rate, and also cardio zone. Are you in your zone? Are you in your cardio zone? What is that? Typically a zone. And I say typically because some people will argue, no, zone is between these numbers and these numbers. Well, it's not an actual hard set number, but typically fitness professionals use 70 to 85%, 75% for some people that are a little more aggressive, 65% for those that are less aggressive. But for our argument's sake, I'm going to say 70 to 85% of your maximum heart rate is your zone. And I'll show you how to measure that, how to figure that out. So that's pretty well where you want to be working out, especially if weight loss or fat burning is of interest to you and one of your main goals. Okay, there's a lot of myths associated with heart rate, and I'm going to talk about myths. I think I always talk about myths when we're talking about any subject of health, fitness, or wellness, but there's a lot of deception about heart rate. Being out of breath is an indication of heart rate elevation, but just being out of breath does not mean you're in a cardiac state, a cardio zone. Now, the reason I bring this up is that I have clients that will get out of breath. And if they've been out of breath during their resistance session at any point in time, they feel like, well, I've already done my cardio because I was out of breath. Well, not necessarily. When you're out of breath, when you're exhausted to the point of failure, you're really in an anaerobic state. Now, we've talked about this before, the difference between anaerobic and aerobic. Now, stay with me. I'm not going to get too deep into this, but when you're lifting weights, you typically are doing repetitions that usually don't go over maybe 20 repetitions, sometimes 15, sometimes 10, because you're trying to work the muscle to failure. And if you do get out of breath, which you can get out of breath rather quickly, like you can in a sprint, that means your heart rate has spiked. And you're into a point of anaerobic state, which means without oxygen. Now think about it. That makes sense. You're without oxygen, which is why your body is breathing, working so hard to get all this oxygen in. No different than when you sprint and then at the end, bend over, you're trying to quote unquote catch your breath. That means you're in a state when the body is without oxygen, trying to get all this oxygen, and that's anaerobic state. It's not a cardiac state, or what we call your cardiac zone. In your cardiac zone, which I was saying earlier, we're going to use for this discussion, 70 to 85% of your maximum rate. In the lower end of that, 70, 75, you're at a conversational pace. Now, what I mean by that is, yeah, you'd like to stop, but you can keep going. You can sit there and have a conversation and talk or whatever, well, you're in a cardiac zone at that time. In other words, if you're out of breath, you can't talk. And if you cut off your air, you can't speak. I mean, language comes and voice comes from air passing over vocal cords. So if you can't breathe, then you can't talk. That's why there's an international sign for choking, because people can't breathe when they're choking. They put their hands up to the throat because they can't say, hey, I'm choking, because they can't get any oxygen going through. In a cardiac zone, a cardio zone, 70 to 85%, you can usually talk. You can usually have a conversation, and we call that a conversational pace. 80-85% gets a little harder, but you're still not without oxygen. You're at the top end of that cardiac zone. So out of breath, when you just get out of breath, you have not done a cardio bout. You've done an anaerobic bout, but you have not done a cardiac bout. So another misconception about heart rate zone is that typical calculations to figure your target heart rate zone or your heart rate zone can be extremely, extremely inaccurate. And the reason I say that, and the reason that's so important, is that I've seen this. In fact, I ran into this early on in my career with a client. I was actually holding him back because at his age predicted heart rate zone and age predicted max, he would constantly go over that. And so I had a heart rate monitor on him. We were doing heart rate training, which was very popular in the 80s and the early 90s. And so when he would hit that number, I'd get worried and I would stop him. And he was fine. He was having a conversation. He was okay, but he was up there, but he was nowhere near what was his actual heart rate zone. He was in real good shape. He could run a heart rate a little bit higher. And so we were training him for his age, which again is not a measurement of fitness, instead of training him towards his real true ability. And I did some research on it and figured that out. So we started pushing him a lot harder, and I got a lot better results because of it. Also, I have clients that when they get out of breath or they get their heart rate up, they've got to wear a heart rate monitor. I have one particular client, he wears a heart rate monitor, and he will sit there and tell me, oh, wait a second, let me stop a second and see where my heart rate is, see whether or not I should keep going. Now, if you just heard what I said a minute ago about whether or not you can talk, whether you're out of breath, whether you're in an anaerobic state or an aerobic state, he was worried that his heart rate was getting too high and maybe he needs to take a break because he could be out of his heart rate zone. But he's giving me this long drawn out dialogue talking about how high his heart rate is. And then once he finally can punch up the number on his Apple Watch and tell me, oh my goodness, look at this, I'm at this high number, we must stop now. Hate breaking his heart, tell him, no, if you're able to talk to me and tell me those things or whatever, and your heart rate is at that number, I promise you're in very, very good shape. And we had to redo his numbers using a different calculation than an age predicted zone. So what about that? What are the different ways of figuring your target heart rate? And that's very important. Now, the most popular one is what we call the age predicted max. And you've probably heard this, but age predicted max is taking 220 and subtracting your age, and that's supposed to be your maximum heart rate. And if you've never done heart rate training before, and especially if you're new to exercise, it's a great rule of thumb. It really is. It usually puts you in a safe zone, let's put it that way. And it could be a really good zone for you to train in. It's not exactly wrong, but it's one way of figuring it out, and it'll give you a good idea. And then you take that number, 220 minus your age, and that gives you your maximum heart rate. Then you multiply that by 85%, and you multiply that same number by 75%. So maximum heart rate times 85% will give you your top of your target heart rate zone. Maximum heart rate times 70% will give you your lower end of that zone. And then those two numbers give you your heart rate zone. So do some simple calculations for you, but I think that's easy enough to figure out. With age predicted, I'll give you an idea of some target heart rate zones, just so you have some numbers to work with. If you're 20 years old, then your heart rate is going to be 100 to 170, that would take you, actually, that's 50 to 85% of your zone. So top of your zone would be about 170, and your maximum heart rate would be 200. If you're 50 years old, the top of your zone would be 145. Maximum heart rate would be 170. 40 years, 153 and 180. I think you can understand. And for those that are a little bit older, 70 years old, the high end of your heart rate should be 128, and your maximum heart rate is 150, according to the age predicted calculation of 220 minus your age. The second way of actually measuring or figuring your maximum heart rate is using heart rate reserve. This is what we know as Walrud's technique. And it involves a little bit more math, but you don't have to do a lot of sprinting or anything to get there. There's another technique that we'll get to that'll tell you about that. We actually do a lot of running. And what they suggest is use the formula for calculating your heart rate. You take 208 minus 0.7 times your age. So 0.7 times your age, 208 minus that. And then I give you a little bit more accurate measurement of your maximum heart rate, and therefore you can figure your zones off of that. So don't want to bore you too much with that. I'm getting a little bored with it, just going through all these calculations and what have you. So, but that's another way. But last one before we get off of it is what we call the Conley's method. Now, this one I recommend doing with a professional. I recommend if you really want to get into your maximum heart rate and really get a real accurate, personalized idea of your maximum heart rate, then you're going to need to do a little exercise. And I recommend you have somebody with you when you do this, just because you're going to push it pretty hard. Now, what you'll need when you do this, you'll need a measured distance, and we typically recommend 400 meters. In other words, your typical high school track. It's going to be a 400-meter track. And the way you'll get to this number is the first thing you do is just jog the 400-meter, just as a light warm-up. Kind of get good and warmed up before you do this. And then you want to run the 400 meters as fast as you can. Take a little break after the warm-up, but then run the 400 meters as fast as you can. And then you want to do a light warm-up, then run it again, light warm-up, run it again. And it's actually, that'll end up giving you 6 laps. But immediately after that third set, right when you come off that, as fast as you can, you come off that last lap, check your heart rate. That's going to be your maximum heart rate. And like I say, I'd rather you have a professional out there when you do this, because we're going to be taking you to a maximum heart rate. But that'll give you a very, very good idea of what your maximum heart rate is. You're stressing the body. It is a sprint, but it is a long sprint, so you're not going to get the strange spikes that you get with a 100 yards or 50-yard sprint. And since you're doing it and measuring on the third lap, then your body is fully warmed up. Your arteries and vessels and veins are all wide open, so you're getting good transport of blood, and that gives you a true maximum heart rate. So a few different ways of figuring your heart rate with, like I said, the age predictive max being the simplest. And if you have any questions, you want to get into that a little deeper, you can contact us at Personal Edge Fitness here in Mobile at 251-341-0927, or our Eastern Shore location. Josh, I'm sure, would be more than glad to do that for you. He's at 251-651-0927. Contact us and we'll be glad to do a simple evaluation to find out, help you figure your maximum heart rate and get to your target heart rate zone. Heart rate exercise starts in your warm-up. If you really want to stay tuned to learn more about heart rate and use heart rate effectively, then you want to start in your warm-up. Now, you hear this a lot. You hear warm-up a lot, and I have clients that come in on a hot day and say, well, I'm warm. Well, that's not the same thing. What a warm-up really is opening those vessels up, making sure that you're getting good transport of energy, transport of oxygen. So you want to get that heart rate up, and you want to get it to a sustained 70% for a good 5-10 minutes or so to give yourself fully warmed up. You're going to have a much better opportunity to keep from injuring yourself through tears or pulls or what have you. Everything is going to be ready to go, let's say. So, and when you're doing heart rate training, especially for cardiovascular work, staying in that 70 to 85% zone, what that does for you is not only does it train the heart muscle, which is the most important. And when they did the original study on heart rate training, this is what they were interested in doing. This is where cardiac rehab came from, is training and working the heart's a muscle. So you want to work that thing out, exercise on a regular basis, and that's where we came up with those ideas of 70 to 85% being a heart rate zone. But most people don't come to see me for training their heart. Yes, it's part of it, and it should be the most important part, but the main reason why people come to see us, well, it's weight loss. They're wanting to burn fat. You begin to burn fat, just like I've talked to you about an accurate measurement of fat is body fat measurement, not weight measurement. Well, if you want to know whether or not you really are burning fat, you've got to be in your target heart rate zone between 70 and 85% for 15 minutes straight before you start to burn fat. That's why heart rate training is so important. If you know you're in your zone, not just guessing at it, but you know you're in your zone, then roughly at 15 minutes, you'll start to burn fat. Up until then, you're burning ready energy. Your body's operating like it normally does. It's used to, hey, you gave me some breakfast this morning. I'm going to run off of that today. There's no reason to go after those fat stores. If you've heard my podcast, Feeling the Fat, you know why your body puts fat on. It is a store of energy, not only warmth, but also energy. Your body doesn't see any reason in that first 15 minutes to tap into that fat source. And it takes some time to get into that fat source. It's like you're outside and you're cold and you need to warm up really, really quick. Well, you're not going to grab the log and throw it on the fire. You're going to grab that toilet paper, that cardboard, that kindling, that pine straw. You're going to create a fire really quick that way. And you're going to throw the log on later and let it kind of catch on. That's how fat burns. And in order for that fat log to burn, then that pine straw and that cardboard and everything is going to need to burn for about 15 minutes to get it warm enough to start to burn that log of fat. It's probably the best way to think about it. But that's why it takes some time to get down into a fat burning stage. You have to get past your body's natural inclination to use ready energy before it starts to get into burning the fat. So That's one of the big reasons for using heart rate training is to know exactly when that fat burning stage is and then staying in that fat burning stage for, 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. So in a 30-minute cardio bout, you're actually doing 15 minutes of fat burning, which is pretty substantial. And also, the more you do that, the easier it is for the body to get into that fat burning stage. Sometimes people after that 15 minutes, they start feeling faint because their body's not used to switching over to running off of the fat. But the more you do it, the more your body gets used to that. So another reason for the heart rate training, this is one of my favorites. I feel the need to talk about cardio because that is something that we always associate with heart rate training. But the other thing I want to talk about is anaerobic training. Now, you've heard me speak about this before. I'm a huge fan of anaerobic capacity, increasing anaerobic capacity. Aerobic capacity, they spend a lot of time in cardiac rehab doing that. A lot of people spend a lot of time increasing their aerobic capacity. Marathon runners going out and running 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 miles. They've got to build up their mileage. They're training their body to be able to manage to stay in an aerobic state for a substantial amount of time. An aerobic state, as we said earlier, that's your cardiac zone. That's your 75 to 85%, that conversational pace. Well, that anaerobic pace, and we've spoken about this before, anaerobic capacity training is like circuit training, and that is sprint, recover, sprint, recover, sprint, recover. And anaerobic capacity is your body's ability to recover after a very strenuous bout of exercise or activity. Now, the reason that's so important is twofold. First reason it's so important, let's go to the vanity side of it. That happens to be my favorite son. If you increase your anaerobic capacity, you're going to make your body a fat-burning machine. You're going to break down muscle tissue. It's going to expend energy. It's just trying to build that muscle tissue back. You're going to create muscle, which requires more energy to live. Therefore, if your body's using more energy, you've got a better opportunity of burning that stored energy, and stored energy on your body is fat. That's why increasing anaerobic capacity is so important. But you've got to know where you are in anaerobic capacity. You've got to know where you're training. I mean, if you're hitting max every few minutes, you can pass out. I mean, you can hurt yourself. You can do some serious damage. But if you're staying at that 80, 85% and you're hitting that every single time and then letting it come down and hitting it again, and you're watching your beats per minute, you're watching that heart rate, the faster that heart rate comes down, the faster it comes down, the healthier you are, the more fit you are, the better you're going to sleep, and the better your energy level is. Now, I talked about that when I talked about the energy podcast, that your energy level is going to be much better because your resting heart rate is going to be lower. Now, why is that? Well, simple. The more efficient your body is, the less your heart has to work. If you've got to push a ton of things out of your way in order to get across a room, let's say you're going through the woods and you're not taking the nice little path, you're taking the one my wife loves. It looks like you're trying to make a path every time you're going through the woods. That's going to be harder. That's going to take a lot more energy. Well, that's what your blood's doing. If it takes a long time for those blood vessels to open up, if you've got a bunch of junk in there because of being less fit and therefore you've got basically fat in your blood, it's going to be harder for your heart to work. You're going to have a higher resting heart rate. Therefore, it's just like doing kind of a fast walk all day long. At the end of the day, you're going to run out of energy. But if your heart rate is lower, in other words, your heart has to work a lot less in order to get you through your day, your energy level is going to be far higher. You're going to sleep better. You're going to sleep better because your heart rate is going to drop into a low heart rate, which is an unconscious state, and actually stay there longer. Now, I'm sorry, I don't want to get too deep into that. We've talked about that when we've talked about energy levels, but that's why it's so important to know when you're doing anaerobic training or aerobic training, right where you are as far as your heart rate is concerned. Trying to stay in that zone, and if you're doing anaerobic training, hitting that upper zone, and right when it drops out of that lower zone, right when it drops out of that 70%, hit it again. Hit it again, run it back up to 85%, let it drop down to 70, hit it again, run it up. That's going to be stretching that rubber band, as I like to say, and making your body far more efficient and expending more energy, and therefore burning more fat. I made it a long way in the show without taking some water. Listen, whenever you see or hear that sound, everybody, you know about to take in some water. The water is the greatest nutritional advice I can possibly give you. It burns more fat than you can possibly imagine. It is the magic pill. I want everybody taking in plenty of water and tracking it daily. Final notes on heart rate, and I've kind of beat that to death. There's a lot more information on that. If you're interested in something a little more intense, a little more directed, a little more detailed as far as heart rate is concerned, feel free to call us at Personal Edge Fitness at 251-341-0927 here in Mobile, 251-651-0927 on the Eastern Shore, or reach out to me at Garrett@personaledgefitness.com. Be more than glad to answer your questions about this topic or any other, but especially heart rate. Folks, make the best of your training. Get a simple heart rate monitor They do it with Apple Watch. Garmin makes several. Polar makes several. They're out on the market. You can find them all over the place. Even Fitbit makes one. But get one and start tracking your heart rate and make more effective use of your training. Hey, you've been listening to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast. This is your host, Garrett Williamson, reminding everybody, stay hydrated.
Thanks for listening to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast with Garrett Williamson. Subscribe now and be a part of the show by calling 251-278-EDGE or message us on Facebook and Instagram at Personal Edge Fitness or at Team PE on Twitter, and visit us at personaledgefitness.com.